have Sayyid Suleiman here. We are very happy and glad to have him here, inshallah. It's going to be a learning opportunity for all of us. As Sister Ali mentioned, we tried to slightly change the format. We're still going to have the conversation, and we will still welcome every questions during the session. But then also, we have this basically kind of a short overview of the program that will be available as a slide, so you can see where we are trying to go. That is based on some of the comments and feedback that we received from the previous nights. So again, you will be welcome to ask questions during the conversation, but also we ask you to write down any comments or questions that you may have from related to tomorrow's program. So we will be collecting them throughout the program and by the end of the program. So we will be trying to base the conversation on tomorrow also based on the questions that we will be collecting from you tonight. So without further delay, we inshallah start the conversation, and I asked Brother Sayyid Suleiman to have an introduction for us on the topic of death and hereafter.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we will be discussing the topic of the hereafter and death and our Islamic belief about that reality. In the introduction, I want to mention just one point in a very brief fashion. We all know that Islam has an emphasis on iman bil ghaib, belief in ghaib. And normally, if you look at an English translation of the Quran, the translation of ghaib is the unseen. Those things that are out of our sight or out of our senses. And the natural tendency that all of us have with regard to what is unseen is to assume that it is less real, it is less present than that which we can see. We have people who are empiricists. We have people who think that only something that I can see or I can perceive with my senses is worth being considered real. And Islam says that it's very important for a person, first of all, to recognize that there are realities and that there are truths that go beyond just our senses and our sensory perceptions. And the recognition of that is essential to our being able to derive guidance from the Quran and derive guidance from Islam. So the Quran is Hudan lil Muttaqeen. It is a guidance for the pious. And one of the attributes of the pious is الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, that they have a belief in the ghaib. So Islam says that this is an essential attribute of achieving guidance. Now, does that mean that you have to have a belief in God and you have to have a belief in angels and a belief in specific attributes of the unseen world? Well, that knowledge comes once a person is able to benefit from the Prophet and his teachings and the Quran and its teachings. Initially, what you need is a recognition and an openness towards things that go beyond just the superficial. In reality, I can sense through my hearing, through my vision, and through my other senses, certain actions that you might do that are friendly or perhaps are unfriendly. But when I make a conclusion or I reach a conclusion about you being a friend and having affection for me, or being an enemy and having animosity towards me, that is something that goes beyond, not very far beyond, because it's still closely tied to the material world, but it goes somewhat beyond simply what I can perceive with my senses. And that is an essential part of our humanity. We live our life making those kinds of conclusions. We don't say that, well, this person did certain things that seem to be friendly. We say that so-and-so is my friend. That is a conclusion that is one level into ghayb. When we say that something is the cause of another thing, then that is one step into going beyond just the superficial. Right? What I can observe is, every time I bring the match to the dry wood, then I can cause a fire. But the causality is not something that I can perceive. That is something that I need to use my mind, my intellect, and my fitrah in order to be able to achieve. And that receptiveness to looking beyond the superficial and realizing that sometimes that which cannot be perceived with the senses is actually more real and more profound than that which can be perceived by the senses. That receptivity is what allows us to be able to achieve guidance. So if I want to be able to benefit from the Quran, I have to reorient myself. And I use my senses and I use my perceptions in order to be able to think about and reach conclusions about that which goes beyond. And the Quran expresses this very beautifully, of course, in Surah Al-Fajr. One of the concepts that is introduced to us in Surah Al-Fajr is that you have a life in this world, and the Quran calls it hayatul dunya, it calls it life. We are alive. We have all of the corollaries of being alive. We grow, we learn, we change, we develop, we move towards a certain destination. But then the Quran says that when a person dies and will be brought back to life, يَوْمَئِذٍ يَتَذَكَّرُ الْإِنسَانُ, on that day a person will all of a sudden realize something. And what will the person say? يَا لَيْتَنِي قَدَّمْتُ لِحَيَاتِي. If only I had sent something forward for my life. And that's not qualified now, my longer life, my eternal life, my more meaningful life. يَا لَيْتَنِي قَدَّمْتُ لِحَيَاتِي. That is the life. And once we see that, we will not really consider that temporary period that we were on this earth with very limited time, limited experiences. We don't even consider that to be our life. So that comes from having that receptivity. That comes from being open to try to understand that which lies beyond and that which is deeper than the superficial. And that is an essential component to our faith. We shouldn't think of the ghayb as being just that which is unseen, but we should think of the ghayb as being that which goes beyond what is seen and what is perceived, in order to bring us into familiarity and into an understanding of that which is eternal, that which is more meaningful. So to understand death and to understand the significance and what comes after death and the logic by which Allah will govern our affairs in judging our souls, in judging our lives in this world. That is an essential part of living our life in a worthy way. A person cannot live a worthy life without thinking about, without knowing about death. So that is an introduction to the importance of this topic, and inshallah what we hope to accomplish from it, and inshallah we will go through a few of the themes that that you have prepared. Would you like to maybe just speak about the different themes so that people have?
Yes, I mean, we have listed them on the screen. So basically, it doesn't mean that we have to focus. I mean, stay within these basically subtopics, or you won't be able to ask any other questions related to the other hereafter. But these are the areas that we thought are interesting to discuss, and we try to basically go through them. Of course, again, you're welcome to raise hand, stand up during the conversation, and we will welcome your questions or comments. And we want to have it as a live conversation. We don't want to have it like a very pre-planned, basically, program. So, so the first topic that we wanted to basically discuss was about what to expect after death. So, you know, we have some narrations, we have heard of narrations about, okay, after somebody dies, there will be some questions that, you know, they say Nakir and Munkar, people will be asked about who is their Imam, who is their Prophet, some of the things that they have been doing. Some people say that there will be some pressure or some like hard time at the grave, you know, so there are some stages that are described, I would say, in a pretty old-fashioned way, and I'm not saying that they are not accurate, but I'm saying that, I mean, maybe not very, like, I mean, they do look like some stories or very basically descriptions of the things that someone might just doubt whether they're exactly as they're going to happen for a dead person. I was also basically, more recently, I mean, going through some literature about some research, actually, some academic research on near-death experience. People who basically biologically died and then returned. So there is a record of the experiences that those people had. It's very interesting that some of the things that they explain about what happened to them, and there was a recent article actually by, I think it was a professor at Harvard University, so about that these similar experiences are by themselves an evidence that there is something in the hereafter life. And there is actually a lot of commonalities between people of very different cultures, very different geographic, basically, areas for providing the same kind of experience. So, so I guess the question is kind of clear. So what to expect after we die? What we learn from our religion, and what do you think about the other things that are mentioned around in this area?
It's quite a detailed question, and so I'll maybe address just one part of it, and then we can continue through the discussion. What does our religion tell us about what we should expect after death? I'll start with that, and then, inshallah, some of the other topics that you mentioned, we can incorporate them as we continue the discussion. Islam, in the Surah Al-Fajr, in the verse that I recited, يَوْمَئِذٍ يَتَذَكَّرُ الْإِنسَانُ وَأَنَّى لَهُ الذِّكْرَى. On that day, man will remember, or will realize certain things. And is it really possible, is it easy for a person to remember? One of the main things that will happen upon the soul being freed from the body is that a lot of things that seems to be hidden from us will be made apparent to us. A lot of assumptions that we had about this, about the world and about the nature of spiritual realities, those assumptions will all of a sudden be shown not to be true. Right? So I might think that, well, because I had an easy life in this world, I was born in good circumstances, I never had absolute poverty, and then there's other people who are kind of like the extras in a film. Right? They don't have a name, they don't have a major role. I might think that, well, Allah has a greater concern for me than for those people who are, quote unquote, beneath me, socially or economically or in other circumstances. And once we leave this world, the first thing that's going to take place is those false assumptions. We will realize that they are false. Ideally, we should have cured ourselves in this world. But a large number of people, perhaps even the majority of people, will still have a great deal of those ignorant assumptions. And those will be shown not to have any reality. The assumptions of what's going to help us and what's going to get us through the hereafter. The other thing that we find in our religious instruction and teachings is that there are two types of people who will have a very vivid encounter from the moment their life comes to an end. And then there is one type of person whose experience after death will not be quite so vivid. And so if a person did not really train their soul, kind of just lived a very superficial life, did not think about things too much, maybe did not have a great deal of intellectual capacity, and did not use the intellectual capacity that they had, that person, after they die, right, their soul will be removed from the body. There will be some accounting that they will be responsible for their actions, and there might even be some of what I talked about, some of those false assumptions being clarified. But then, that person will not know whether they are going to be rewarded or punished in the hereafter. They're not going to have a very vivid experience in barzakh, or in the grave, until the Day of Judgment. They'll be in suspense. And they might even be in a kind of reduced state of consciousness. Those people who developed the potential of their soul, either in a favorable or in an unfavorable direction, those are the people who will have a very vivid experience right after they die. And of course, those who develop their soul in an unfavorable direction, that vivid experience is going to be a very scary and a very painful experience. But they will be alive. They will be alert, and they will feel the pain and the punishment right from the moment they leave this world. It's not going to wait until the Day of Judgment. Because they made certain conscious decisions that harmed their soul. So their soul is no longer just potential, but it has come into actuality, and it will suffer those consequences. And the opposite is also true. Those who did a great deal of good and consciously made a choice to be pious and to be good, they will also begin to get their reward. They will, in a figurative sense, enter paradise right from the moment of death. And those are people who will actually even be able to frequently visit their families. So the connection between the living and the dead remains. The living will not perceive that the dead are visiting them, but the dead, if they are pious, and their soul has come to that actuality and it has the strength, it needs to be developed. Okay? They will actually be able to function after death by perceiving and hearing and witnessing things of their loved ones, once they are in the grave. It's kind of like if you have a weak muscle, if you've been injured. Through physical therapy, you can strengthen yourself and you can walk without a crutch. And a person who is able to walk without a crutch, whether they've trained themselves for good or for evil, their soul will be able to work. But those who have not trained their soul, then once the crutch of the body is no longer there, their perception will be limited.
So do those people already know whether or not they're prepared before they die, that they are in that state?
There are certain signs that we can use to measure ourselves. Right? If I have a hard time making a choice that might be materially harmful, but that is the right choice, then that tells me that I have not yet developed an independence from my material connections. And so that tells me that I have not moved in that positive direction. Now, I might be still uncertain, or I might be in a position of being in a spiritual direction. So if, for example, making a material sacrifice, or risking my reputation, or risking my life, or sacrificing my property for the sake of Allah, that's very difficult for me to do. And that is a sign that we haven't yet made that movement. And much of our worship really is meant to be training for us to be able to make that conscious change. And so we have fasting, we have prayer, we have hajj, we have i'tikaf. One general principle in Islam is that Islam actively discourages us from trying to taste worship by removing ourselves from the world. Because if you remove yourself from the world, you're not practicing that independence. You're not practicing being able to make the right decision constantly. And you've basically once closed off certain doors. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to try to earn a living. Right? And then once you're in that path, then you don't really have as much of a challenge after that. Now your momentum and your inertia will continue taking you in that direction. That's not what Islam wants. Right? It's more difficult to fast in the month of Ramadan if you are not fasting consistently. Once you have even one day that you're not fasting, it becomes a little bit more difficult for the body to discipline itself. But in Islam, we are not encouraged to fast every day, and in fact there's certain days when it's forbidden for us to fast. And so all of that is so that we can practice. That's one of the goals of our worship. Practice being able to live in a state where you actually have to make an active decision with some difficulty to turn away from a material existence. That's the strongest way we have to test.
How about, brother, how about these general, have you heard about these near-death experience researchers? What do you think, what do we have to say about them?
About near-death experiences. There are some people who use near-death experiences as evidence for life after death. Okay? The evidence that we have that's given to us in the Quran and in Ahadith is of a different nature. It goes back to our intellect, and it goes back to our fitrah. And that is really the evidence that we should be relying on. Now, there are uses for other types of facts, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there is a danger for us to use experiences, near-death experiences, maybe the story of an arif who had a vision, or who spoke to somebody who or dream, or a vision. There's a danger to using those. And that is that in many cases, some of those experiences, some of those visions, some of those dreams, they are part of this world. They're not really an experience of somebody who has transitioned to the next world or has even been on the bridge to the next world and then come back. And it's very difficult for us, even perhaps impossible for us, to really know. Now, if God tells the prophet that I am going to give you a message about the hereafter, that is from the other world. If God allows the prophet or an imam or even another individual to speak to somebody who is deceased and is in the hereafter, then that is a conclusive argument. We do have some ahadith and some narrations that indicate that. But if it's something from your experience or my experience or even the experience of the dream or the vision of an arif, then we don't have any way to conclusively know, is that really a message from the hereafter, or is it still within this world? So to use these experiences as evidence of life after death is not something that is a constructive step. It might actually cause our faith to be somewhat shaky, because it might turn out that in 20 years or in 5 years, people will be able to give a chemical and a hormonal explanation of some of these visions and some of these experiences. In that case, it might not be from the hereafter, but there is still a use, right? Even if there is a chemical explanation, even if there is a way to artificially induce a near-death experience, that doesn't mean that then that chemical or hormonal level is all that there is. It is our belief in Islam that the body is under the control of the soul. The soul is not material, but it interacts with the body. And so the chemicals, the food, the environment, the physical environment, the electrical and chemical environment that the body is subjected to does affect the soul. And the fact that we can induce certain differences in emotions or experiences or even memories by electrical means, by chemical means, does not mean that your body is just, your biochemistry. It doesn't mean it's limited to that. So as experiences, they are useful. They give us a little bit of a fuller picture. They give us certain food for thought. They might give us certain imagery. But in terms of an argument to prove life after death, they are deficient in being able to prove life after death.
Are there any questions, comments, brother?
Yes, I have a question about this measurement over the body. So, do we have any, religious document that's explaining the relation between soul and body? Then we can say, okay, this is the interaction of the soul and body. Now I'm going to measure body somehow, then I will understand and I can measure soul. So, I mean, is there any way that can go further and measure soul and show experimentally that, okay, there is soul?
No, the soul is not something that is meant to be measured. It's not something that can be measured. Islamic philosophy says that there are three kind of levels of existence. There is the material existence, which is substance, matter. There is a purely non-material existence, which is in the heavenly realm, and it's said that angels, for example, belong to that purely non-material realm. And then there is an intermediate realm. That intermediate realm is those things that are non-material in their essence, but they are material in their actions. And that is the human soul. So the human soul is not material, but it's not like a heavenly being. It's not like an angel, for example, that doesn't need a body in order to function. And this is a philosophical discussion. It's not based on hadith in particular, but this is something that is part of the Islamic philosophical field. Right? The difference between the soul and a non-material being is that the soul, although it is not material, it can only really see, it can only really act by an interaction and by a connection to the body. And the process of the development of the soul is a process of becoming more and more independent of the physical body, until a time comes when God says this is the moment when the body is going to be separated from the soul, and the soul will continue its existence on its own. Now, if we're lucky, we will have prepared ourselves for that, and that transition will be somewhat easy, because we won't need the crutches of the body. If we are unfortunate, then we will not have prepared ourselves, and when the moment comes for the body to be separated from the soul will be separated, but it will not be in a healthy state to carry its independent existence. So, if the soul is, if that philosophical understanding is accurate, then the soul is not something physical to be able to be measured by physical instruments. Right? Now, in the Quran and in the Ahadith, we don't have any explicit indication that the soul has a material or a physical component that would be able to be measured. So even if we ignore that philosophical discussion and we just look at the Quran and the Ahadith, we don't have any expectation or any reason to say that we should be able to measure the soul. I think you probably asked that question because there are a lot of efforts that have been made to try to prove or disprove, right, the eternal life. And the fundamental fallacy, the fundamental flaw, is that we're assuming that that which is real is that which can be measured through the senses. And if something is only going to be for us to connect through the fitrah, or only for us to connect through the intellect, then it's not as real. It's not yet proven or established until you can do an experiment, until you can have, some kind of physical observation. So we're subordinating that which logically and Islamically should be primary to that which is secondary. In Islam, and this is why I began from that introduction, right? Our humanity comes in recognizing the fact that these two things that I see always coming together and that are correlated, that is a superficial thing. But for me to be able to perceive causality between them, even though it's not material, that is a deeper reality. For us to be able to put the ghaib in its proper place and recognize that the ghaib is not secondary and less real than what is present and what is shahada and what is witnessed. That is a very important step. So these kinds of experiments, they are misguided if we're trying to use them to prove. However, they're not misguided if we're trying to use them to gain insight. Because of course, we're going to gain insight about the ghaib through what is present and what is perceivable, what is shahada.
It's we have a lot of descriptions about the qiyamah, about the even about basically the hell, the fire of hell in the Quran. So there are some detailed descriptions, there are some general descriptions, there are descriptions of people who are enjoying in the paradise, people who are under suffering. So how accurate are these statements? Are they exactly describing something as if we would be basically experiencing the exact same?
So there's some very vivid descriptions.
Right.
Let me actually mention a few of those vivid descriptions, maybe just one or two, that we have in the Quran. There's a verse, Surah Dukhan. In Surah Dukhan, we read, إِنَّ شَجَرَةَ الزَّقُومِ طَعَامُ الْأَثِيمِ كَالْمُهْلِ يَغْلِي فِي الْبُطُونِ. The tree of Zaqqum, it's a name in the Quran, the tree of Zaqqum, that will be the food for the evil one. And it will be like, according to one translation, it will be like molten metal that will be in that person's stomach and that will be boiling and bubbling in a person's stomach. You can imagine that image, right? How hot does a metal have to be to turn into a liquid? And then if that is inside of a person's body, what will it do to the entirety of a person's body? Right? Or another verse we have in Surah Al-Kahf, that if they ask for help, if they ask for ighatha, if they ask for assistance, then they will be given assistance with water that is like molten metal. And so I'm calling out in a desperate state in the hereafter, and the help that I will be given is molten metal. And the unbelievers will be so thirsty that they will drink it. And the verse in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 29, it says that will roast their faces. If you have a metal on, then that's what would happen. Right? And so you have other vivid expressions as well. Now the question, and I'd like to ask this question to our audience so that we don't just have one-way questions, but we have questions. What would you think of a person who gave those kinds of descriptions? Right? I mean, if I were to say to somebody that if you do this evil, then this is what's going to happen. is that a little sadistic? Is that a little bit, is that something that will make us uncomfortable? And when we read these in the Quran, sometimes those of us who don't speak Arabic or don't understand Arabic, it's a little bit fortunate for us because we don't quite understand the vividness of the expressions. But if you read the translation, you think about the translation, or if you understand the Arabic, and you're reading about people drinking pus, right? Or eating from an open, festering wound. Or if you read about a person's skin burning off, and then being given a fresh skin. And every time their new flesh and skin becomes ripe, becomes fresh, then it's burned off again. And when you read these descriptions, a point comes when you start to get somewhat sick. It affects a person's body. And so before we talk about whether it's figurative or not, one reason why people want to think of it as figurative is because it's quite uncomfortable to imagine that this might be real. And what would be the mercy of a God? What would be the kindness of a God who would describe punishments, or who would literally enact punishments like that? That is something that might give us pause. Many of us probably, if we were asked, do we support the ban on cruel and unusual punishment in the U.S. Constitution, or should it be repealed? We would say, oh, that's good. Well, how is this not cruel and unusual punishment? So, how would we resolve that?
I think that if we think on the other side, the good things, those things are really not that much uncomfortable. So basically sometimes you feel like, okay, the drinks, and the food, and all those things that you're talking about, they don't really...
So every time you hear about the unbelievers having to drink rotten pus, then you say that, well, on the other side there are rivers of milk and honey and gardens. And so that's the same question, right? Is it the true description of heaven? But at least one solution is yes. The Quran is not one-sided, a book of pure evil, in the sense of pure punishment, pure harshness, and pure torture. Certainly, there is the other side of that. But even if we take that, right? Even if we admit that yes, there is a very beautiful description of paradise, right? Which will either be equally literal or equally figurative. The fact that it does have such harsh punishments, does that in any way make it more difficult for us to think that God is merciful? Does that make it any way more difficult for us to love God?
On the contrary, it makes us think that we shouldn't do this and live a better life.
Okay, good. So it makes us think that we shouldn't do those things and we should live a good life. But is it based in fear only? Or can it also be based in love?
Dr. Saleh, one of the hadiths, he says that Imam Zainal, one of the du'as is that you have shown us, you have prevented us to go near the sins by scaring us with these punishments, and attracted us towards good by showing us all these rewards. So there is a psyche which is used here, which is the fear and
So does that mean that it's not real, it's just for scaring us, or it's real?
No.
That's a question.
Yeah, when you bring up the psychology, do you mean that it's psychological? Or do you mean that it is real?
I think as with some of the Islamic punishments from a societal perspective, though they may be harsh, I think they're there for preventive reasons. Some punishments are there because, and it says to, do that in front of believers, is because I think they have a preventive.
How can we think that God is lying?
So we'll get to that question in a moment, right? There is a psychological element, but what does that psychological element mean? That's a separate question. We'll get to that. But before we get to that question, I want to, several of you have made good points about the preventative nature, about the psychological nature, about the fact that when we have both sides of the coin, it really motivates us. I don't want to be having the dinner of hell. I want to have the dinner of paradise. Right? So, but what is the way in which we can explain that as being a sign of God's mercy? That we have that motivation, yes, but not as fearful children, but as adults who are attracted to that message. Imagine, having this conversation with somebody who is disgusted by the violence of some of these descriptions of punishment. How would you contextualize it and explain it? And I think several of you are moving in a very positive direction. And you should probably do this more often and have me talk less and share the insights from the audience. But I think we still need to have a more comprehensive explanation. We haven't quite gotten there. So sister, you were going to say something and then we'll get to you others.
No, I was going to say it would be difficult to explain that verse to someone who's coming into Islam and wanting to know about Islam and Allah's mercy. I would have to say it would be hard for me to.
It would be hard,
Allah's mercy,
but
for me to try to explain.
But would you censor it, or would you try to explain it? And if you remember, I don't know if you were here, but when we talked about the Quran, this is one of the reasons why I did say that if you have a friend who's interested in Islam, then don't be lazy and just say, here's the Quran. Call me when you're ready to take the Shahada. Right? That's how a lot of Muslims kind of approach conveying Islam and sharing Islam, and it's lazy, and it's you might actually, if you do that with 1,000 people, you might get 10 of them to be attracted to Islam. But you will have 20 of them, like you said, it is difficult. And they will say, if this is how your God's going to punish the evils, I'd rather be a Jehovah's Witness. I don't believe in them. Right? So you need to have a certain background, you need to have a certain setting of the stage. And that's what we want to talk about. The brother had a question, and maybe
sure. I mean, if we have 10 minutes to start, we just want to have some summarizing.
So then
I just want to make.
So you have to be brief.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make 2 points. First of all, the God says that these punishments are natural consequences of our actions. So it's not something that it's really the God is cruel to do something. We're doing something which the natural consequence of that is this punishment. It's like the drinking alcohol and getting drunk. It's a natural consequence of that action, is that punishment. The other thing is that there is an explanation, I think, for that, is that the way that God punishes us is for purifying us. There are humans are punishing each other for, I don't know, for different things.
So I'll have to cut you off there. So your first point was that, as the Quran says, that وَلَا تُجْزَوْنَ إِلَّا مَا كُنْتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. You're only going to get what you yourself have done. And your second point was that there is an aspect of purification, but not all punishment is purifying. So those who are going to be punished for all eternity, obviously, they're going to be punished for all eternity. But I'm sorry to have to cut you off, because we want to hear from one other comment. And a sister as well. And
I had the same point.
Similar point? Okay, good.
Yeah, he actually had a similar point as well. I was going to just like this is actually a subject that I have like a lot of problems with as well. I was like reading through the Quran and like seeing these like descriptions. But I guess like always going back to the idea of just how Allah is not only merciful, but He also has to be just at the same time. And that was the one thing that always like kind of brought me back to the idea, because if we didn't have like this system of punishment, and then it wouldn't be just at all, because you have like these horrible people who will do all these killings and like tons of disgusting things.
People do terrible things, and God's justice demands that. So basically, I think what you've said, quoting the verse, and it's not just the verse of Surah Yasin, it's mentioned elsewhere in the Quran as well, that you're not going to be given a punishment except for what you've done. What I would say is an explanation, if you're dealing with it to a non-Muslim, is actually to give an example, right? Now let's say, for example, that I have a teenager and they just got their driver's license and they don't think that they're ever going to die, and so they're going to text and they're going to speed and they're going to do a whole bunch of dangerous things while they're driving. Right? What should I do? As a responsible parent, as a loving parent, through my mercy, not even through my justice, I'll say, look, you can get in trouble like that. Now, what if the child doesn't listen? I'll go and say, you can get into an accident. Let me take you to a collision yard and show you what happens to a car, right? And hopefully then they'll realize that you put your phone away when you're driving, right? And all of us adults too, it's not just the teenagers. And then they go to the collision yard and I still see that it hasn't affected them. Well, then is it logical we take the next step and take them to the ICU and say, look, this is what happens to the person. Now I'm getting progressively more graphic, progressively more violent. Is that mercy or is that harshness?
Guidance.
It's guidance, it's mercy. Right? The reason why I need to be so harsh is not because and it's not because God wants to give us these vivid descriptions. It's because God knows we are that completely oblivious teenager. And if God were simply to say, look, heaven is a good place, hell is a bad place. Right? That should be enough if we were worthy people, but it's not enough for us. So he has to go and he has to spell it out in all of that detail. So yes, it is a matter of God's justice. It is a matter of us getting exactly what we want. But the critical step that we have to understand and that we have to be able to explain if we're ever trying to explain that to a non-Muslim is that the reason for the vivid descriptions is because of our own state as human beings. It takes that much for us to be able to sometimes motivate ourselves to avoid sin. So it's a statement not of God being sadistic, of enjoying a violent description. It's a statement of us being oblivious, and we can perceive that. So now, is it real?
Yes. So I want you to give me a yes or no at least before we get to the time of the...
It is real, yes. And the evidence that we have of that, the motivation, the psychological reason is what I described. That God sees that, well, we're not going to be happy just by the description, and we're not going to be happy by the visit to the collision yard, and we're not going to be happy by the vision to the ICU. We need to see something more. That's the psychological reason. But when we say it's psychological, it doesn't mean that God is lying. It's psychological because God created our psychology, and our psychology is part of the entirety of His creation. And so the descriptions that He gives are in view of our psychology, but they are descriptions that are in line with the realities of His creation, the realities of the cosmos. And as the Quran says, that everything that God describes, no matter how violent and no matter how harsh and no matter how gross it may seem, right, it is, in reality, exactly what we have earned. So the good and the bad, it's just God taking away the filter, taking away the curtain, and showing us that our human soul has an infinite potential for ascending to the heights of salvation, and it has an infinite potential for descending to the wretchedness of perdition. But that's God doing us a favor by opening the curtain. The reality is that when we do injustice, we are causing that.
So I guess, brother, we can, inshallah, in the next 5 minutes, we can go ahead with the third and the fourth question, which were about, okay, how is our knowledge and action going to affect that hereafter? And then how we can possibly get some help from Ahlul Bayt to have a basically more peaceful
So to be very brief now, because we're coming up towards the end of our time, I mentioned, actually I think it was in the Arabic session, maybe not in the English section, there is a hadith that we have that before the time of Nuh alayhi salam, there wasn't a sharia. There wasn't some of that explicit instruction that God had. Maybe because society was simpler, maybe because there were few distractions and people were more easily able to connect to their fitrah. But some ahadith say that the people at that time before the sharia, they were in a state of dalal, in a state of misguidance. And other ahadith state that they were just kind of left to their fitrah. And they were left to their fitrah, they were not misguided, but they were not also able to achieve the insight that comes from a prophetic mission. And the conclusion that we get from these types of ahadith and certain explicit ahadith that talk about the role of intellect and aql, the conclusion that we get is this: God will only judge us based on the amount of insight that we had access to. So every one of us is held to a sliding scale, to a scale of what we had access to. If we were living in the time of Prophet Nuh or before Prophet Nuh, before there was a Sharia, we would be judged on our fitrah. If we have strong intellect, we'll be judged to a higher standard. And so all of us will be judged according to that standard. The question that comes in many people's mind is then, are we not better off keeping ourselves ignorant? And ignorance is bliss. Right? And the reality is that we're judged based not on what we end up knowing, but what we had access to. So if I know that there is a moral question, if I know that there is a prophet claiming to bring a message from God, I can't say, well, I'll just close my ears, I'm not going to hear, and then I'll be ignorant and I'll be excused. Having access itself is sufficient for me to be morally responsible. And then the last question was what?
So I guess, yeah, so we have basically two groups. Group one is the people who are ignorant. Group two, people are in a way following a religion, maybe not Islam, maybe Christianity, based on a religion that is basically kind of there's a relationship with God, but maybe it's not the perfect relationship as we believe. And the third group are the followers of Ahlul Bayt, which we believe are the most complete, basically Muslims, inshallah, if they are in the right, basically people. So, what is the difference between the three? Like, how are so you said the first group are not lost, but they will be judged based on what they have. So what is the benefit of being a member of the third group versus the people of the first or the second group? How is that going to elevate the person, and how is that individual going to benefit from that relationship to be in a better position compared to the other two groups in the hereafter?
The difference really is a difference of having a connection to Ahlul Bayt, which is going to open us up for salvation. There's a hadith which is narrated from Imam Muhammad Baqir والسلام, in which he was speaking to a person. He said that you people think that the most hopeful and the most hope-inspiring verse of the Quran is when God says, Ya ayyuhalladhina asrafu ala anfusihim la taqnatu min rahmatillah. Right? Inna Allah yaghfiru dhunuba jami'a. O you who have wronged yourselves, don't lose hope in God's mercy. God forgives all mercy, all sins. Right? The door for forgiveness is always open. And the person said, yes, that's what we think is the most hope-inspiring verse of the Quran. And then Imam Baqir says that we Ahlul Bayt don't say that. The most hope-inspiring verse of the Quran is when God says to the Prophet, وَلَسَوْفَ يُؤْتِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى, that, O Messenger, God is going to grant you until you are pleased. And the reason for that is that, well, the verse about all sins being forgivable if we repent, that's great. It gives us a lot of hope. But it really is only as far as we can go. There's no element of grace. There's no element of the divine favor and the blessings of the Prophet. As we talked about the verse earlier where the Quran says that when they sin, let them come to the Prophet, let them ask for forgiveness. That's as far as this verse goes. But then, and the Prophet should ask forgiveness for them. That grace that comes from the Prophet, that is even more hope-inspiring. Because the Prophet is so high in rank that he can take us by the hand and he can bring us to a much higher rank than we can earn on our own, even than we can earn by seeking forgiveness from God and receiving forgiveness from God. So, وَلَسَوْفَ يُؤْتِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى, the Imam says that is the most hope-inspiring verse of the Quran. It talks about shafa'ah. And that was the teaching of Ahlul Bayt. This hadith, by the way, is mentioned in Sunni sources as well. And it reminds us that connection to the Prophet and to Ahlul Bayt, that allows us not just to earn what we have earned through our piety, through our sincerity, through seeking forgiveness, but it allows us to get what we will earn through a connection to those who have traversed the path, and to go farther than we can go on our own terms. That recognition, that openness, and that hope is something that allows our soul to move in a much more exalted direction. I think that we are out of time.
Yes, thank you very much. If you show the last slide, so the next slide is basically a topic for tomorrow night, which is piety and moral perfection. We do invite everyone to, if you write down your questions on this topic, you may have time at the end of the iftar. You can collect those questions on the topic of piety and moral perfection. So we try to get some sub-areas under the main topic based on the collection of questions that we have tonight. And so thank you very much, and with that I guess we need to conclude the program. Again, we announced that we will welcome contributions if the community basically should support inshallah the program so that it can continue, and there is so much blessing with helping on the Ramadan iftar preparation or other expenses of this special program inshallah. So with that I conclude the program. If you want to say a couple of sentences as prayer.
Inshallah, I think that we are out of time, so I pray to Allah that He accepts our worship and our fasting, and that He answer the dua, the prayers, and grant the hajat of all of us present and all mu'mineen throughout the world. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.